Science. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for what is our third lecture in this year's Planet Ocean Seminar Series. Tonight, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Till Wagner, a esteemed colleague and close friend. Very happy you could do this for us tonight, Till. A little bit about Till. Till is an ice and climate scientist and assistant professor in the Department for Physics and Physical Oceanography here at UNCW. His main research interest is how ice in the polar region grows, moves, and melts. And he's also studying how the changing polar ice conditions are connected to our changing climate. Till completed his PhD in Applied Mathematics at the University of Cambridge and worked as a researcher at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography in San Diego before joining UNCW. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speaker, Dr. Till Wagner.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you to the Bluefish Society. Thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I will try and switch over this slideshow so that it's my slides. Sorry, 1 second. There we are. I've decided to make this sort of a two-part talk. I want to talk the first maybe half or 1/3 about the new Arctic, and by that I mean what are the changes happening in the Arctic on a sort of from a wide-angle view, and why that matters, and how that will maybe impact us and also the people living there, and the ecosystem of the Arctic. And then the second part of the talk, I would like to get into a bit more detail of what I actually do and what I've been doing in the Arctic, and the science I've been doing since I joined UNCW especially. So I'll start a little bit, and if you have questions, if something's unclear, please just raise a hand or interrupt me. I'll start with a little Ice Science 101. So the Arctic is broadly defined as the region north of the Arctic Circle at about 66 latitude north. So it covers the northernmost parts of our globe. The Antarctic is down in the south, and there are, and I'm deviating a little bit here, but I want to highlight a couple of crucial differences between the south and the north. So this might be a projection of Earth that's not so familiar to you. This is how I mostly see our planet. This is the south, here's the Antarctic, surrounded by the Southern Ocean, and here you see Greenland, the US, Russia, and there is the Arctic, which is mostly an ocean. So this is what we call Antarctica and the Arctic. The crucial difference is that Antarctica is a continent. It's a landmass that is covered with very thick meteoric ice, and that means it's land ice, it's ice that comes about by snow falling and not melting over thousands and thousands of years. It's just compressed snow, that's all it is. The Arctic is mostly an ocean, and the ice that covers the Arctic is just the frozen top of the ocean, basically like lake ice, just on the ocean. And so it's salty. As the top of the ocean freezes, it contains salt. I stole a little illustration from the National Geographic of sort of, this is the Antarctic, and they've taken out a slither here to show that there's mountains under the ice sheet. But this ice sheet is roughly 4 kilometers or 2.5 miles thick. And it's basically taking half of Wrightsville Beach, half the length of Wrightsville Beach, and flipping it upside down and dropping it onto your landmass. So if you took a cross-section, if I sort of cut this and plotted it as a cross-section, it is this giant mountain of ice that has enough volume of ice that if you melted all this ice and you distributed the meltwater evenly over the global oceans, you would raise sea levels by about 60 meters. which sounds scary, especially if you live in Wilmington. The Greenland ice sheet, so these are both drawn on the same scale. The Greenland ice sheet is much smaller, but that in itself also has about 6 meters of global mean sea level rise in it. And now I don't want you to worry too much. These are melting at very slow rates, and there's even some discussion of whether the eastern part of Antarctic here at the moment is melting at all. But Greenland for sure is losing mass, and so is the Antarctic overall. And that will be more or less it in terms of what I'm going to say tonight about land ice. The rest of my talk is going to be focused on sea ice. So this ice that grows in the Arctic on the ocean. And that is a very different matter. It's 1,000 times thinner than land ice. Sea ice is on average 1 to 2 meters thick, maybe 3 or 4. Sometimes it gets sort of shoved together by the winds and it breaks up and it piles on, then it can be maybe 10 meters thick, so you can sort of see these blocks here. And there's us working on this rather flimsy surface. Before I talk more about sea ice, there's one more terminology that I wanted to clear up. What is an iceberg? Yeah. So we've talked about land ice and sea ice. An iceberg has a very clear definition. An iceberg is a piece of land ice that has broken off the margins of either Greenland or Antarctica. So it's an iceberg is fresh. It's not salty. Yeah? It's just compressed snow, just like the Greenland ice sheet. And they can be hundreds of meters thick. They can be very large. They can be the size of small American states. You always say, like, this iceberg is some multiple numbers of Delaware. And so they have their own dynamics. And I love icebergs. I could talk about them all night. But I will focus. I will limit myself to sea ice for today. So I'm fortunate that NASA has a fantastic visualization studio, and they create these beautiful animations. So the Arctic sea ice is waning and growing with the season every year. Every year it grows to about 16 million square kilometers, which is roughly the size of Russia. And then it shrinks down in the summer. In September it shrinks down to about 4 million square kilometers, which is roughly the size of India. So you can imagine what a giant pulsating forcing that is on the climate. Now, we can take sort of the sea ice extent and draw the sea ice cycle. So this is the seasonal cycle. Each colored line here represents 1 year. So in the winter you get up to 16 million square kilometers, and then you go down to 4, and then it comes back. And I can color code these lines by the year of measurement. Yeah? So these were taken over the last 40 years since we have satellite data that allowed us to do this. And if I color code them by year, we find an interesting pattern. And that is that in 1979, the further back we go, the lighter the color. Yeah? And you can see that in more and more recent years, so the darker colors, the sea ice has decreased quite substantially, and especially in this September minimum. And so you might have heard in the media sometimes people say about the Arctic might be ice-free soon. And what we mean by that is that it might be ice-free in September. Yeah, it will, as long as, for many hundreds of years, there will be ice in the winter. And that's like how we get lake ice in colder parts of this country, right? It gets cold in the winter, the sun goes away, and you grow ice. But in the summer, when there's a lot of sun, you might lose the ice. So we can take every September value and plot a time series of the September values. Where is that? Yeah, so this every September since 1980. And in September 1980, it was roughly 8 million square kilometers, and that has approximately half by now. So we've lost half the sea ice cover over the time that we've had satellites. And there's a bit of a question of like, how is this trend? Is this just going to continue like that? In which case, we'll probably lose it around 2050, 2060 in the summer. But there's also a question, might be faster or slower. The thing is that the aerial cover is not the whole story, right? You're also interested in like how thick is this ice that we have. And so we've got advanced satellites now that allow us to actually measure the thickness to a certain degree. And so everything that's white here is thick ice, and the darker, the thinner the ice. And you can see how much that thick ice has disappeared. So the change in thickness and thereby the change in volume is actually much more dramatic than just the aerial cover. So in September, we have lost about 75% of the sea ice volume. Now, okay, that has important implications. Yeah, and I want to highlight a few here. Shipping in the Arctic was never anything that was conceivable for most parts of the past century. This is a graphic that I took from the New York Times where they show the potential shipping routes from basically 5 years ago until the next 10 years. And you can see that there's shipping routes opening. The northern passage here, the northwest passage. And for most part, there's still, you need icebreakers. Those are the red lines here. But you can, ships that are accompanied by icebreakers can make it through these other passages now in the summer. And actually, there was a container ship for the first time in 2018, a commercial container ship that sailed from Europe to Japan. And that is significant because this distance is a fraction of what you have to go through if you want to go through the Suez Canal. If we project forward, by 20 years from now, 25 years from now, you will be able to go fairly easily, probably through most of the northern passage. You might not even need icebreaker company. So that increases the general interest in the area. The next thing I want to highlight is zoom in on the Yamaha Peninsula in northern Russia and Siberia, where the Russian government has just allowed for a giant liquid natural gas plant to be built. It's a $27 billion project that was just finished late in 2018. And the reason why they were able to build this now and why it's economically viable is because, you can't quite see it maybe, but there's the jetty here. So this is right on the coast. And the sea ice has decreased enough that they, for a substantial time of the year, they can bring the ships in to bring the natural gas out. And I found this so striking, I wanted to show you one little picture of the scale of this thing. This is one of the liquid natural gas tanks, yeah, that they will fill with LNG. One more example is tourism in the Arctic. And that as well has become more and more. There's different factors that there's also sort of like technological advances that allow for that to happen more. It's more easy to actually go to the Arctic. But I pulled some data here from it's like the Council of Arctic Nations. They have tourism data. And you can see this is only over the last 5 years. These are small numbers in thousands. These are cruise passengers. But over the last 5 years, the number of cruise passengers in Svalbard has doubled. The same in Greenland, and in Canada it's actually tripled almost. So that means that there's a lot of interest in maritime jurisdiction in the Arctic. You can see Russia has the largest claim area-wise, and in yellow there's the Canadians. The American aerially it's actually not that large. It's up here in blue. There's the Danish or the Greenlanders and the Norwegians. Those are the main countries with stakes. And you know, as the sea ice disappears, this becomes an open ocean, and it somewhat becomes a new frontier. And I found this quite striking quote in the paper that published this figure, which is, "The perceived openness of Arctic space enables it to become a space of masculinist fantasy and adventure, which is mirrored in contemporary accounts of Arctic geopolitics." So it's like the new Wild West. There's a lot of posturing, there's a lot of saber rattling. The Russians in 2007 took a submarine to the North Pole and planted a flag on the seabed and subsequently turned it into a stamp. The Americans' US Department of Defense strategy document from 2016 says that we need to evolve DoD Arctic infrastructure and capabilities consistent with changing conditions and needs. When I was at Scripps, I was funded by the Navy to work on the Arctic. And after a while working there, I learned that I wasn't just funded by any department of the Navy, I was funded by the Department of Battle Space Development. And my advisor at the time, this is kind of a funny story, my advisor at the time was, because his money was coming from the Navy, he was briefed, and he was briefed that he had to be careful with foreign nationals. He wasn't really supposed to be talking to foreign nationals too much about this topic, especially ones that would ask him a lot of questions. He should be suspicious. And that put him in a little bit of a tricky position, because my job as his postdoc student was to ask him a lot of questions about the Arctic. So all this interest, and new developments and new opportunities, there's typically people who suffer, and in this case, as often, it's the Arctic peoples who get put under a lot of strain from climate change and the change of the natural system, but also from the geopolitics at play. And then there's obviously the animals. These are the top 10, I think, endangered charismatic megafauna, and that's obviously the ones that we care about. But what I want to focus on today is about the less charismatic little critters at the base of the food web. And that sort of concludes my first half on the wider Arctic topic. And now I would like to talk a little bit more about science. Any questions?
We're having a little trouble hearing you back here.
Okay.
Especially when your voice drops.
Okay, I must not drop my voice. I apologize. I will speak more loudly. I think that's the easier version than getting a microphone at this point. Yeah.
I have another question.
Yes.
When you showed the trend,
Yeah.
it says 11% per year.
Per decade. Per
Per
decade.
decade. But it looks like a linear trend, not an exponential one, which is what a percentage per decade.
If you applied it recursively, right? But if you apply it at every, if you take the whole, right? I mean, you can define a linear trend per decade on a board.
Oh, okay.
Right? Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's a 40% over 40 years. It's a 40% drop over 40 years. So every 10 years you lose about 10%. So 10% a decade.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there any tide effect that, say, that Russian LPG facility? Is there tidal action anywhere?
There are tides. Actually, the thing that I would be more concerned for them is that a lot of this is permafrost, that region, that is frozen ground, and they've had big issues with the permafrost melting and destroying infrastructure. I think that's more of a concern than the tide effects.
Question?
Yes.
So it looks like Russia wants to claim the gas resources that are there.
Yes.
And it's
So does everyone else.
And they claim the big chunk,
Right.
bigger
So
than anyone else.
So the way that you claim these, the chunks is by the continental shelf that is attached to your landmass. And since Russia has the longest coastline, it has most of the continental
They have
shelf.
the rights to it.
It,
Oh, that-
so if I go back to this slide here, basically everything that's dark is sort of not very much disputed. Those are the typical, I think, the 200 miles exclusive economic zone. But then everything else beyond there, everything that's sort of shaded is, yeah.
How
So-
did this affect the earth? They're pumping, it's not fracking, it's actually digging for
Yeah.
this oil.
Yeah.
It's got to affect the core of our planet, no?
The distance that they go in with this drilling is very small. It's like scraping
Oh,
the top of the
it's not
skin.
miles.
Not mile. I mean, yeah, small relative to the thousands of kilometers thickness. Yes.
If in Russia, if it melted or moved, would they not be able to own it anymore with the mass?
So the way that these things, you mean the way this boundary is yeah. So the way this boundary is drawn is the continental shelf. So it's not the ice, it's the land underneath. Yeah, and that's fairly on human timescales, fairly steady. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so this is a picture, a satellite image of a large spring algae bloom north of Alaska, which is unfortunately not the research area I'm going to focus on, but it's a nice picture and it's a good illustration of what I'm going to talk about. So every spring in the Arctic, the sun comes out, the ice starts to melt, life awakens. And that is kick-started by these phytoplankton blooms, algae blooms. And they typically originate under the ice, near the ice, and then they spread into the open ocean. And they provide the base of the food web. So first you have the algae, then you have the zooplankton, the next level of critters, the krill, etc., come in, eat that, and then you have the fish, and then you have the big animals, and then the humans at the end. And so I've titled this part Boom and Bust, How Spring Blooms Depend on Ice Melt in the Arctic Ocean. And this is work that I've been collaborating with a number of faculty and students. Dylan is here, Heather Koopman of biology, and also Matthias Kate from the University of Washington. And as part of this project, we also went to Fram Strait last year in May, and I want to talk about this in a little bit, but first I would like to sort of motivate why we went to Fram Strait and give you an idea of how these phytoplankton blooms work. So, climatically speaking, Arctic sea ice loss is important for a number of reasons. It is essentially an ice pack, a cold ice pack that you put on top of your planet and keeps your planet cool. It's a little bit like putting a white t-shirt on, it reflects all the sunlight, and if you replace that with a dark ocean, you're going to absorb a lot more. Yeah? So that's one important effect. As a result, because we've been losing all the sea ice, the Arctic has actually been heating up a lot more than the globe on average. So over the last 100 years or so, the 120 years, the average global mean temperature has increased by about 1.5 to 2 degrees. The Arctic has increased by almost 6 degrees. So, that's largely due to sea ice. Loss of sea ice also has an impact on the ocean circulation, on the atmospheric circulation, and on the Arctic ecosystem. And so, since I'm focusing on the blooms, I would like to make that connection between the sea ice, how the sea ice impacts the blooms. So we have these fantastic satellite images. It's really, I think this is so powerful. So we have satellites who look at the ocean and can tell you where there is algae in the ocean everywhere on Earth. And so in the first decade of the 2000s, on average we had these blooms here. I want to draw your attention to these blooms in June. So wherever it's yellow, you have a lot of chlorophyll A. You have a lot of algae in the water. You always get a lot of chlorophyll A in June around the coasts because that's where river runoff comes in and provides a lot of nutrients and the system can blossom. But there's one area of open ocean that really is blossoming well in June. And then if we fast forward and look at the last 10 years, this area you can see has exploded. And if we take the difference of those two, I basically take this map and subtract that map, we have this difference map. So wherever it's red, you have more phytoplankton recently, or chlorophyll A than before. So this region has really seen a lot of phytoplankton growth. And you know, we were always concerned about the Arctic ecosystem dying and then being starved, but these little plants are doing great. So I can zoom in onto this region. Yeah, so this is Svalbard here. There's Greenland here, and this is called Fram Strait, which is the main exit way of the Arctic. Yeah, the Arctic, and most of the ice in the Arctic gets pushed out through Fram Strait. And I can plot a time series. I average over that, and we can look at the magnitude of these blooms over the last 20 years. And you can see that there's been a distinct increase in these blooms. And we were fortunate enough for our trip last year to happen in May 2019, at exactly the time that there was the largest phytoplankton bloom in recent history. So the question that we sort of had is, why are they doing so well? Why suddenly is this region experiencing all this growth of phytoplankton? And so for me as an ice scientist, I'm like, well, maybe it's the ice, right? So let's look at how has the ice changed. So these are the same, kind of the same idea, but instead of phytoplankton, I'm plotting now sea ice. And so this is the sea ice in 2002 to 2010, and then the sea ice in the last 10 years. And then I subtract the two. And wherever it's blue, we've lost sea ice in the last 20 years. So in all these regions here, we've lost sea ice. And I thought maybe the phytoplankton are doing really well in Fram Strait because the sea ice has gone away, or you know, the conditions are maybe more favorable to them. But the sea ice in this region has not changed. In fact, if I plot the time series for these two, so this is the Arctic in June, sea ice has been decreasing steadily. But if I just look at Fram Strait, sea ice has actually, over the last 20 years, been very steady. In fact, it's actually just grown by 1%. But it's basically stayed unchanged. So, okay, maybe the Fram Strait has not warmed as much. Yeah, maybe we have all this ice left there because for some reason that region has stayed cooler relative to the wider Arctic. So I've plotted here the surface air temperatures, and you can see that Fram Strait has actually warmed twice as much as the Arctic Ocean overall. So it can't be just that there's less melt because there's cooler temperatures. So what is it? Well, it is that there is more sea ice being pushed into this region. And so what is happening as the Arctic Ocean is opening up, there's less sea ice overall. the ice starts to move more freely, right? It's less confined in that basin. So you have more cracks, the ice is more free to move around. So now the same winds act to push this ice down into Fram Strait more vigorously. So you're getting all this ice being pushed down Fram Strait into this region, and at the same time we have all these warm temperatures, right? We've said that this area has increased in temperatures. You have more and more ice influx and warmer temperatures. And that leads to an increase in meltwater. Suddenly the sea ice that sits on top of the ocean melts out, and the ice, when it melts, is much fresher. Has less salt than the ocean underneath. So it sits on top. So you end up with this very thin, 5 meter thick, very fresh layer of melted sea ice. And we can, it's a little difficult to measure that. Yeah, the satellites are great. Satellites are great at measuring exactly, like sort of taking pictures, seeing the ocean color. That's how we measure chlorophyll. But they can't tell us how much fresh water there is. But we do have some observations, and we have some models that can simulate that. And I found sort of the best model, or the best halfway model, half observation. It's a state estimate. Which a state estimate is essentially, you take all the observations you have, and then you fill the gaps with a model. And so this is freshwater flux, the change in freshwater flux over the last 20 years. And I think it's very striking. In this area, near the sea ice edge, you've had a lot more melt over the last 20 years. So you have these convergent ice conditions and warmer temperatures that give an increase in freshwater flux in Fram Strait. So let me recap that once more. In this region, we for some reason haven't lost the sea ice. And the reason why we haven't lost the sea ice is because it has been advected from further north. It's been pushed down into this region. At the same time, temperatures have gone up, which leads us to increased meltwater flux. And the nice thing here is that I feel like the spatial pattern of this increase in freshwater maps very strongly to the increase in chlorophyll A. Yeah, so the hypothesis that I'm putting forward is that the meltwater stratifies the upper ocean, and it contains all those nutrients from the ice, and that helps the phytoplankton bloom. And the reason why the stratification, why that lens of freshwater matters is because the algae are passive tracers. They don't swim by themselves. They just sit wherever the ocean mixes. And if you have a very light layer of freshwater up top, then they don't mix down into the deeper ocean. And when they sit up top all day long, they receive sunlight all day long. And so they can grow without bounds. And if you combine that with all the nutrients that are in the meltwater from the ice, then they're just sitting there eating nutrients all day with sunlight shining down on them, and they're doing great. Now, I want to stretch that this is a hypothesis. And so we don't really know much about the nutrients that are available. And we also don't really know how this stratification works, because typically in the ocean you want a lot of upwelling, because upwelling will bring you nutrients from further down, and that will help you grow your algae or whatever. So we got to do a little more work on this, which we have been trying to do. Now, okay, I'll take 1 second for you to process this. Any questions at this point? Yes.
Have you noticed any difference in the fauna because of all the nutrients in the ocean, the krill, whatever?
Yeah.
Have the bigger species
The
increased?
right. So so that was actually one part of the project when we went to the Arctic that we kind of wanted to find out a little more about. What are the repercussions of these changes at the base of the food web to the higher levels? Turns out that is a very difficult question, and we are really struggling to even get a handle on that. Yeah. So, for example, we didn't see any whales on our trip. Now, we were only one boat, and there's not that many whales, and it's a large ocean, so maybe they were all there, maybe they were doing great. We just didn't see them. But yeah, so those are some of the difficulties that I, as a physicist, am very happy I don't have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So the satellites provide this very large-scale sort of wide-angle picture, but we can do better, and so we can either go, but we also have nowadays very high-resolution satellite data. And the reason why I'm quite confident that there is some truth to this hypothesis is essentially this next figure that I'm going to show you. This is Landsat 8 data of late May 2019, basically just at the end of our expedition. And what you see here is where it's very yellow, there's a lot of chlorophyll A in the water. This is really at the height of this blue. On the right-hand side, where it's dark, the water is cold. And in this context, cold water means meltwater from the ice. And you can see that some of these meanders very much, and if you focus on this hotspot of phytoplankton bloom, it is very much correlated with a signature of meltwater here. The same doesn't hold right next to the ice edge, right? There's no bloom here, but there is a lot of freshwater meltwater here. So it only works at a sort of given distance from the ice edge. It's a complicated system, and we've been grappling with it for a while now, but we do have some cool tools that we can throw at it. So with an undergraduate, Connor Lester, who's in the audience, can you wave? and Professor Bill Wagner, we've been working to find a mathematical model that will describe this process. And we're fortunate that very clever mathematicians have gotten almost all the way there, and we're just sort of like adding a little bit. So there's an equation called the Fisher equation, which describes, and you know, I'm aware that this is very complicated, but I just want to sort of like show you like the type of work we do, right? So this is what's called a partial differential equation, and it describes how phytoplankton grow and die and get mixed around by the ocean. And you can use this and you can solve this to describe something like a flow field like that. And this is work, this equation in this form has been applied to phytoplankton blooms by Birch et al. In 2007. And so what Connor has done over the last many months that we have made him do this, and he's fantastically talented at doing the things that we ask him to do, which most of the time make no sense, and then he shows us that it makes no sense, and then we ask him to do something else. And so it's not a linear process. So what we did is we changed this equation by adding a second equation that represents the meltwater. So this first equation just represents your phytoplankton growing. And now we're saying, hey, your phytoplankton actually, the degree to which they die depends on how much meltwater there is. So basically, Connor has added meltwater to this plankton equation. And if this is all quite abstract, I'm fortunate that Connor is very good at making pretty animations. And so this is the model output. And I feel like if you compare the dynamics of this still that we have up here, you can sort of see that I think we're getting there. We're starting to capture what's going on. Yeah, so there's no phytoplankton close to the ice, but wherever you have a lot of fresh water, you're starting to grow, you're growing these phytoplankton. And I could go on. You then analyze the statistics of these models and compare them to the statistics of the data, and you try and sort of find an understanding of the processes. But I think this is really promising work, and Connor will be presenting it at the Ocean Science Conference in San Diego next week. This obviously is a very idealized model, highly simplified, and only captures sort of the leading order processes. We have other models that we can use to project what the whole globe is going to do. And these are models that are millions of lines of code and run by thousands of people, called comprehensive global climate models. It's a huge effort in the climate science community to bring these models together to tell us how the climate is going to evolve over the coming years and centuries. And the data of these models is freely available. So I went and downloaded the data of 33 model runs, and the total meltwater that they project will be input into Fram Strait. Yeah? So I can't look into the future, but these models kind of can. And so this black line is the average of all these model runs, and what it shows you that it's quite exciting. It projects that these models also from 1980 to 2020 see an increase in meltwater, just as we see it in the observations. So the observations that I was talking about is these 20 years where there's been an increase. But the bad news for the phytoplankton in Fram Strait is that once the Arctic sea ice retreats further than it has now, there won't be any more meltwater. And so, if this is the boom years, this is the years of the booming blooming, there is likely to be a bust period when there's no more meltwater. So we've looked at the satellites, we've looked at the modeling aspects, and now we still don't really understand what's going on. So we went to the region to look at what are the details. So there's Connor, graduate student Andrew, Dave Wells here from CMS, Hilary Glandon, a postdoc working with Heather Koopman, and Elizabeth Bailey, another undergraduate. There were a few more people who joined us later. And there's Sammy Seahawk. So we were very fortunate in that the environmental organization Greenpeace every now and again gives their ship for free to a lucky scientist. And last year that was us. So we wrote a proposal to suggest some work, and they gave us their ice-strengthened vessel, including crew and polar gear and everything, to use for 2.5 weeks. So we went and decided that we would like to do take measurements on very straight lines at right angles to the ice edge. And in the end, this is the trajectory that we came up with. It turns out that when there's a lot of sea ice and your ship is a former whaling vessel of the Norwegians from the 60s, you don't go into the ice that far, and you have to sort of avoid it a lot. And so our lines weren't as straight as they maybe hoped. But we still got a lot of, so every dot here corresponds to one sampling station where we collected in situ data. And so the data that we collected, the main instrument that we had here from CMS is a rosette, and this instrument allows you to collect water samples at different depths. You drop it into the ocean, and the bottles close at different depths, and it tells you the ocean conditions, it tells you the nutrients, the life that is at different depths in these in the water column. And then we took this the water out of the rosette, and Andrew and Elizabeth filtered the water so that we didn't have to bring all the water home with us, but we just wanted to bring the stuff that was in the water, essentially, right? That was the interesting part. So Andrew, and the funny thing, so Andrew is a graduate student with me, and he has a biology background. He did his undergraduate in biology, and he was keen to get out of the biology realm, so he started working with me. We went to the Arctic, and we needed somebody who knew how to filter. And the poor guy was so good at filtering that he spent most of his exciting Arctic cruise in the hold of this ship. Now he got out a couple of times, but he's a fantastically talented filterer. And he's not only really good at filtering, he's also a very seasoned mass spectrometer user. And so we have been using this data that we collected, these are the different sample stations, to analyze the samples for carbon and nitrogen isotopic ratios. And those are ratios that allow us to assess how much primary productivity, how much life there is in the ocean, and the nitrogen allows us also to assess where in the food web is all the action happening. Is this something that's just the very base of the food web that's active, or are there sort of the question you were asking, like are there the krill, are the bigger animals starting to be part of this? This is very early stages, this work, and we haven't really had time to like put together a story, but I'm very excited that this data is coming in now. Elizabeth here has been working with Catalina Alves de Souza and Bob York to analyze our rosette samples for chlorophyll A. And this is actually data that this plot I was given by Elizabeth today. So it's fresh off the press, and I think it's very exciting because it shows us on the horizontal axis, it is the salinity of the water. On the vertical axis is the chlorophyll A. And it is a very clear correlation that the fresher the water, the more meltwater you have in the water, the more activity, the more chlorophyll A, which is in some ways just corroborating what I already told you from the satellite data. But now we can resolve this also by depth. We don't just have this top surface and the very large scale, but this is really the individual sampling points. And Elizabeth, who's not here, will also be presenting some of this work at Ocean Sciences next week. We also collected zooplankton data. This is the next level up, little nets that we pulled up to look at how you can look at these little krill. And so, unfortunately, I didn't pick the right picture. You can see in some of these, they have, because they're transparent, you can see the phytoplankton they ate. They have green bellies. And so that's sort of the next level up, right? And the thing that the only reason I was there was because I know how to drill. And so we also went on to the ice and extracted ice cores, because at the end of the day, what we want to do is say, this type of ice with this type of nutrients can lead to this type of bloom, which can then produce the sort of patterns that we observe. And so there's different types of ice. This is the last data I want to share with you. The older the ice gets, the more the salt drains out of it. So by analyzing so basically salt is kind of, you know how you use salt to melt snow in the summer, right? If you have salt in like built into your ice structure, it kind of melts the ice around it and then it drains out over time. So if we find an ice core that is that has low salt, so on the horizontal I have salinity here. If I have an ice core that has low salt, I know that this is old ice. This is depth on the horizontal, on the vertical, yeah? So there's more and more salt as you go down because you get closer and closer to the bottom of the ice. But at the top here, this ice core has drained all of its salt out. Whereas there's other ice cores, these pink ice cores, we know are thirstier, they're very fresh ice. And so if there's more salt, there's more nutrients likely, etc. So we know what ice was in the region, and now we know what animals were in the water in that region, and hopefully we'll be able to put a little more of a cohesive story to this spring bloom, boom bust story that I've been going on for too long now. Thank you. Did I go too long?
No.
Yes, questions?
So what's the difference in the melting point of saltwater-based ice versus freshwater-based ice? Is there a difference in the melting point?
Not really. So the way you include salt into ice is that you basically disrupt the perfect crystalline structure. And so the salt tends to aggregate in little pockets. You call them brine pockets or even channels. And those pockets never actually freeze. Yeah, but the rest of the crystalline structure has the same melting point as the pure ice. So yes.
Did you look at the actual community structure of the phytoplankton, and did it change in the meltwater pulses versus the other areas?
So I can show you the spreadsheet of the community structure. As I said, we got that data like 3 days ago, and Elizabeth made the plot today. Yes, but that's a very good question, and that's part of the next step is to see. So I only showed the chlorophyll A right now, right? But we have it all now. I think, maybe. Yeah.
What nutrients are you finding in the ice?
That's a very good question, and that is solidly outside my field of expertise. They are
Lots of nitrogen?
nitrogen, sulfates, and it depends. And those samples are still running, so we haven't gotten those back. There's also we've taken trace metal samples. There is a question of whether this system is ion limited. It depends a little bit on whether you have ice that maybe has had some deposits, or whether it's just the nutrients that were in the ocean structure.
Or in the snowfall?
And then the snowfall, yes. Yeah. But the exact, nitrogen, sulfates, yes.
Is there a problem with the outburst of phytoplankton?
Is it a problem?
Yes.
It might be. Yeah, that's a very good question. So we don't know how stable the system is, and for the phytoplankton right now, the world is great, right? They're doing super well. They're very happy, but also, for example, that bloom has been shifting earlier into the year. So now they don't live for very long, right? That bloom lasts for maybe a week. So if that week is now happening a month earlier in the year, the zooplankton don't know that maybe, right? So they might come in later and the phytoplankton have bloomed and gone. So those are the types of dynamics that we are trying to understand. Yeah, very good question.
Is there any correlation with CO2 concentrations or any other variables that, and the different, water, different temperature waters coming together, different, solubility to the gases, or any other factors about that could be affecting growth?
We potentially, likely, I think, yeah, I don't know. We haven't looked at gases, and also, there's also a question of whether the currents have changed, whether the origination of the water masses have also are slightly different now. They are definitely warming. The currents are warming as well. So, yeah, but we haven't looked at it. Yes.
Are you going to get a chance to go back?
It's a very good question.
Or do you want to go back?
I do want to go back. It's a lot of work. It's a big undertaking, and so I did a lot of field work like this during my earlier career, during my PhD. And if you go every year, you just amass data, and then you have the data. You've sort of just about managed to organize it by the time it's time to prepare the next cruise. So I've opted for maybe a once every 5 years type of strategy of field work. So yes, I do want to go back. And the nice thing is, the previous cruise that did something similar was about 5 years ago. So I think if we go back in about 5 years, that would be, I think, reasonable, yeah, for me. Yes?
This conference that's going on,
Yeah.
who is that being presented to?
Yeah, so that is the American Geophysical Union, and they have a specific conferences for the ocean sciences. And it is, I believe, somewhere around 6,000 or 7,000 scientists who present to each other. It is a very, members of the public are very much welcome to attend, but the nature of these presentations is so technical that it's usually not that fun, even for me. I tend to, and we joke about this, right? It's a week-long conference, and you go to the talks for the first day, and you're totally burnt out. And then you go have coffees and lunches with your colleagues for the rest of the week. There is sometimes there's a policy element to it, but the interest of the non-expertise people, it tends to be fairly low for these technical conferences. Yes, Anne.
Dr. Wagner, thank you. That was a wonderful talk. And perhaps my question's actually for Connor. I'm not sure.
Oh, yes.
You talked about the idea that the changes that we're experiencing, seeing in the Arctic are due to the albedo feedback, changes in atmospheric and ocean circulation. And the model that you were presenting certainly had very important circulation aspects to it. So can you look forward? I know you showed us your graph where we are in our boom and then we're in our bust. Do you think anything about the model that you created would impact the predictions that you saw in that boom or bust model? Or would you like to go for a coffee after? It seemed like it was your model may have real bearing on how that might move forward.
I don't know.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, I think it's, so the model is highly idealized, right?
Okay.
But in the end, we do have a degree of how much meltwater we do put in, and I think there's a chance that the dynamics of this model are different when you have a high volume of meltwater relative to a low volume of meltwater. That there might be some effects that are different between those two regimes. I would expect that Dylan might disagree, but we can.
No, not necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a world between a model that, even though that might not look simple, that's a pretty simple model relative to the slide after that had like 1,000 time series on it.
Right.
And in that model, people just hit the go button and then they look at the data as if it's the real world because they can't really dig in and understand really deeply what that model does. We understand really deeply, relatively deeply, what our model does. And I think that insight will allow us to say, okay, well, when you fiddle this as if it's increasing meltwater, this is what's going to happen. And yeah, so to answer your question, I do think we get some insight.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes.
So is there no contribution to this from the acceleration of ice loss in Greenland itself?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I was kind of waiting for that question. Yeah. The way the currents work and the distance, we're fairly far. We're like 300 miles from Greenland, and there's a very strong boundary current, western boundary current going down along the eastern coast of Greenland. So it does, all that meltwater does sort of get pulled away. So there's not much of a meltwater signal that we see in the more northern parts of Fram Strait.
Thank you to everybody who came out tonight, especially the members of the Bluefish Society. As always, we appreciate your support for allowing us to put on this seminar series. We will now be adjourning for the traditional refreshments out in the lobby. And I just wanted to give you a heads up that our last speaker for this year's seminar series will be coming in April. It is going to be Dr. Catherine Edwards from the Skidaway Institute of Oceanography. And she's going to be talking to us about her use of underwater robots or gliders. And we are undecided as to whether she should talk about hurricane intensification or fisheries. So do you have a preference? Oh, okay, hurricanes. If this is going to be intensity, hurricane intensity models. Okay, fisheries. Yikes. I don't know. I'll try to see if she can maybe do a little of both. But thank you guys for coming, and Till's available for questions all night.